said, step back!
The screaming echoed through the hallway of Westbridge Preparatory Academy like nothing those walls had ever heard before. 14-year-old Maya Carter was on her knees, clutching her face with both hands, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Her eyes were squeezed shut against a burning so intense it felt like her skin was melting off. She couldn't see. She couldn't breathe. She could only feel the fire consuming her face and hear her own desperate cries mixing with the sounds of phones clicking, recording, capturing every second of her agony. Standing over her was Officer Derek Morrison, a white police officer in his mid-40s, pepper spray canister still in his hand, his face showing not concern, not regret, but cold satisfaction. Around them, white students held up their phones, filming, some with expressions of shock, others with barely concealed smirks. And there, in the background, stood a blonde girl named Chelsea Bradford, arms crossed, watching Maya suffer with a smile playing at the corners of her lips. This is Maya Carter. And in 48 hours, her father will systematically dismantle everything Officer Derek Morrison holds dear. But to understand how we got here, to understand why a decorated police officer would deploy a weapon designed for violent criminals against a 14-year-old honor student, we need to go back. We need to go back to that morning, before the hallway, before the pepper spray, before everything changed forever. Maya's day had started the way most of her days started, in the small but warm kitchen of the home she shared with her father, Marcus Carter. The smell of eggs and turkey bacon filled the air as Marcus moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, the same way he did everything in his life. Methodical, precise, intentional. At 45 years old, Marcus Carter had the kind of presence that commanded respect the moment he walked into a room. As a civil rights attorney, he built his career on fighting systemic injustice, on being the voice for people the system tried to silence. But that morning he wasn't a lawyer. He was just a father making breakfast for his daughter. Maya sat at the kitchen table, her schoolbooks spread out in front of her, reviewing notes for her upcoming debate competition. She was the captain of Westbridge Prep's debate team, a position she'd earned through sheer talent and relentless practice. On her left wrist, she wore a delicate silver bracelet, slightly tarnished with age. It had belonged to her mother, who'd passed away from cancer 3 years earlier. Maya never took it off. It was the last piece of her mother she could carry with her every day. Marcus placed a plate in front of his daughter, and she looked up with a smile that still carried traces of the little girl she'd been before grief had forced her to grow up too fast. Their relationship was built on trust, on open communication, on a foundation of love that had only grown stronger after loss. They talked about everything. Her classes, her friends, her dreams, her fears. That morning they talked about the debate competition coming up that weekend. Maya was nervous. She wanted to win not just for herself but to make her father proud. Marcus listened as she voiced her concerns, then looked at her with those steady, patient eyes that always made her feel safe. He told her something he'd told her 1,000 times before, something his own father had told him growing up in this same neighborhood, facing discrimination that should have broken him but instead forged him into who he became. Excellence is our baseline, not our ceiling. Those words were more than motivation. They were survival. They were the armor Maya wore every day when she walked through the doors of Westbridge Preparatory Academy. Because Westbridge wasn't just any school. It was one of the most prestigious private institutions in the state, the kind of place where 5-figure tuition was the norm and family legacy meant everything. The campus looked like something out of a movie, with its brick buildings and manicured lawns, its state-of-the-art facilities and teachers with degrees from Ivy League universities. Students walked those halls knowing they were being groomed for success, for power, for the kind of future most people could only dream about. Maya was one of only a handful of black students at Westbridge Prep. She'd earned her place there through academic excellence and a scholarship for exceptional students from underserved communities. She belonged there, her grades and achievements proved it, but every single day she was reminded in small ways that some people didn't see it that way. The microaggressions were constant. The surprised looks when she scored highest on a test. The questions about whether she was there on scholarship, asked with just enough sweetness to make calling it out seem like an overreaction. The way some teachers would lower their expectations, speaking slower to her as if she couldn't keep up, or raising them impossibly high as if she had to prove herself twice as hard as everyone else. Maya handled it all with grace, the way her father had taught her. She kept her head high, her grades higher, and refused to let anyone make her feel like she didn't deserve to be there. But if there was one person who made Maya's life at Westbridge particularly difficult, it was Chelsea Bradford. Chelsea was everything Westbridge Prep valued. Blonde, pretty, wealthy, and connected. Her father, Robert Bradford, wasn't just rich, he was Westbridge rich. He sat on the school board, donated generously to every fundraiser, and had the kind of influence that made administrators nervous about ever saying no to his daughter. Chelsea knew it too. She moved through those halls like she owned them, surrounded by a rotating group of friends who laughed at her jokes and agreed with everything she said. And Chelsea had a particular talent for cruelty disguised as humor. She'd make comments about Maya's hair, her clothes, the way she talked, always with a smile, always phrased as a joke. When Maya didn't laugh, Chelsea would act hurt, confused, as if Maya was being too sensitive. The teachers never said anything. The administrators never intervened. Because Chelsea Bradford was untouchable and everyone knew it. Maya had two real friends at Westbridge. Jasmine, a biracial girl with warm brown eyes who preferred observing to participating, who'd experienced her own version of never quite fitting into either world. And David, a white student who'd transferred to Westbridge sophomore year and immediately gravitated toward the kids who actually cared about ideas instead of status. David was on the debate team with Maya, and he'd proven himself a true ally, the kind who didn't just say he cared about justice but actually stood up when it mattered. The three of them formed their own small circle in a school that often felt isolating. They ate lunch together, studied together, supported each other through the particular challenges of navigating a place that wasn't designed with them in mind. But there was another presence at Westbridge that everyone had learned to navigate carefully. Officer Derek Morrison. He'd been hired 3 years ago as part of the school's security enhancement program, a former city cop who patrolled the hallways with an authority that sometimes felt more like intimidation. The students called him tough. The faculty called him dedicated. But there was something about Officer Morrison that had always made Maya uncomfortable. The way his eyes would linger on certain students. The way his hand would rest on his pepper spray when he addressed black and brown kids. The way he seemed to be looking for problems instead of preventing them. That morning, as Maya walked through Westbridge's front doors, adjusting the straps of her backpack and touching her mother's bracelet for comfort, she had no idea that Officer Morrison would change her life forever. The morning passed normally enough. First period English, where they discussed symbolism in literature. Second period calculus, where Maya solved equations that made half the class groan in confusion. Third period history, where the discussion of civil rights movements felt both relevant and painfully ironic. And then, between third and fourth period, in the crowded hallway where students moved between classes in a chaos of conversations and locker slams and teenage energy, everything fell apart. Maya was walking to her next class, her books balanced in her arms, her mind half on the essay due next week and half on the debate competition. The hallway was packed, students moving in both directions, the noise level rising with dozens of simultaneous conversations. Maya was focused on not getting knocked around in the crowd when suddenly her books went flying. They scattered across the floor, papers sliding in different directions, her carefully organized notes spreading out in a mess that would take several minutes to reorganize. Maya looked up, startled, and saw Chelsea Bradford standing there, her hand still extended from where she'd accidentally knocked into Maya's arms. But that wasn't the worst part. As Maya knelt down to gather her books, she felt something snap around her wrist. Her mother's bracelet, the clasp already weakened from years of wear, had broken from the impact. The delicate silver bracelet fell to the floor, and before Maya could reach for it, Chelsea's designer shoe came down directly on top of it. Maya's heart stopped. That bracelet was everything. It was the last physical piece of her mother she had left, the one thing she could touch every day to feel connected to the woman who'd raised her, loved her, prepared her for a world that would try to diminish her. And now it was under Chelsea Bradford's foot, probably damaged, possibly destroyed. Maya looked up at Chelsea, her voice steady despite the emotion rising in her chest. That was my mother's. You need to apologize. The hallway around them had started to quiet. Other students were noticing the confrontation, sensing drama, pulling out their phones with the instinct of a generation raised on viral videos and social media spectacle. Chelsea looked down at Maya with an expression of mock confusion, as if she couldn't possibly understand why Maya was upset. Then Chelsea's face shifted into that familiar smirk, the one that said she knew exactly what she was doing and knew she'd get away with it. Maybe if you weren't taking up the whole hallway, she said, her voice loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear, people wouldn't run into you. The comment landed exactly as Chelsea intended. A few students laughed. Others looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Maya felt heat rising in her face, anger mixing with humiliation, but she kept her composure. She'd dealt with Chelsea's provocations before. She knew how to handle this. She stood up slowly, her mother's bracelet now in her hand, examining it to see if the damage was permanent. But Chelsea wasn't done. She stepped closer, invading Maya's space in a way that was deliberately aggressive. You know, Chelsea continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness, maybe you should be more careful. Some of us actually belong here. That was the line. That was the moment when 3 years of microaggressions, 3 years of coded language, 3 years of being made to feel like a visitor in a place where she'd earned her spot, all came crashing down on Maya at once. But even then, even with her chest tight and her hands shaking, Maya didn't retaliate. She simply said, loud enough for everyone to hear, I'm not doing this with you, Chelsea. Just leave me alone. But Chelsea had an audience now and she played to it. She pushed Maya, not hard enough to really hurt her, but hard enough to make it clear this was escalating beyond words. Maya stumbled back a step, shocked because Chelsea had never gotten physical before. The crowd around them grew larger, phones held high, everyone recording, everyone watching, no one intervening. Maya's voice rose, firm and clear. Stop. Just stop. But Chelsea pushed her again, this time harder, slamming Maya back against the lockers with a metallic crash that echoed down the hallway. Maya's back hit the metal with enough force to knock the air from her lungs. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that sounded almost excited, as if they were watching entertainment instead of assault. Maya's hands came up defensively, not to fight back, but to protect herself, to create space between her and Chelsea's continued aggression. Get off me, Maya said, her voice loud now, projecting the way she'd learned in debate competitions, making sure everyone could hear. Get off me. And that's when Officer Derek Morrison arrived. He pushed through the crowd of students with the kind of authority that made them scatter immediately, creating a path to the center of the confrontation. He saw Maya, a black girl with her hands raised, her voice elevated, her back against the lockers. He saw Chelsea, a white girl with her arms at her sides, her face arranged in an expression of fear that hadn't been there seconds before. And in that split second, Officer Morrison made his assessment. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask who started it. He didn't look at the phone's recording, didn't consider that there might be evidence, didn't use any of the de-escalation techniques he'd supposedly been trained in. He saw what he expected to see, what his biases told him he was seeing. A black girl being aggressive. A white girl in need of protection. What happened next would be captured on multiple phones from multiple angles, would be watched millions of times, would spark protests and investigations and national conversations about police in schools and racial bias and the use of force against children. But in that moment, Maya Carter just saw Officer Morrison's hand reaching for the pepper spray on his belt, saw him pulling it free, saw him pointing it directly at her face. Have you ever witnessed something so unjust it made your blood boil? Drop a comment below and let us know. And if you want to see how Maya's attorney father delivers justice that will leave you speechless, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next will restore your faith that accountability is still possible. Maya tried to speak, tried to explain, but her voice came out shaking, uncertain, because she was 14 years old and there was a grown man with a weapon pointed at her face. I didn't do anything, she said. She pushed me first. I was just defending myself. But Officer Morrison wasn't listening. Step back, he commanded, his voice hard, aggressive, the kind of tone you'd use with someone dangerous, someone threatening, not an honor student in a school hallway. Step back now. Maya was already backed against the lockers. There was nowhere to step back to. She was complying, her hands visible, her body language defensive not aggressive, doing everything right, everything she'd been taught about how to interact with police. I'm step back, sir, she said, her voice breaking slightly. I'm not doing anything. Chelsea stood off to the side, her face arranged in perfect victim expression, and when Officer Morrison glanced at her, she nodded, confirming whatever narrative he'd already constructed in his mind. Around them, the crowd of students watched in silence now, the excited energy replaced by something heavier, more uncertain, as if they sensed they were witnessing something that had crossed a line. I said step back, Morrison repeated, louder now, angrier, as if Maya's compliance was somehow defiance. And Maya, confused, scared, but still trying to follow instructions, still trying to do everything right, said one more time, I am step back, sir. I'm not. She never finished the sentence. Officer Derek Morrison deployed his pepper spray directly into Maya Carter's face from a distance of less than 3 feet. The chemical weapon designed for violent offenders, for dangerous situations, for threats to public safety, was used on a 14-year-old girl whose only crime was being black in a school hallway. The effect was immediate and devastating. Maya's hands flew to her face as the burning sensation hit her like fire, like acid, like nothing she'd ever experienced. Her eyes slammed shut involuntarily, tears streaming down her face, mixing with the chemicals to spread the burning across her skin. She couldn't see. She couldn't breathe. Every gasp for air brought more of the chemical into her lungs, making her cough, making her gag, making her feel like she was drowning on dry land. She dropped to her knees, the impact barely registering through the all-consuming pain in her face, her eyes, her throat, her lungs. Sounds became distant, distorted. She could hear screaming but didn't realize it was coming from her own throat. She could hear other voices, shocked exclamations, someone crying, but it all felt far away, separated from her by the wall of agony that had become her entire world. Jasmine's voice cut through the chaos, high and frightened. "Oh my God, Maya." She rushed forward, trying to reach her friend, but Officer Morrison stepped between them, blocking her path, his voice commanding Jasmine to stay back, to not interfere. David was there too, his face pale with shock, his phone out but forgotten in his hand as he watched his friend suffer. And Chelsea Bradford, the girl who'd started it all, the girl who'd pushed first, the girl who'd escalated the confrontation, stood untouched, unharmed, watching Maya writhe in pain on the hallway floor with that same small smile playing at her lips. The crowd of students stood frozen, their phones still recording, capturing every second of Maya's agony, documenting the moment that would change everything. Some looked horrified. Some looked uncomfortable. But none of them intervened. None of them challenged Officer Morrison. None of them spoke up to say that what they just witnessed was wrong. Because that's what happens in systems designed to protect some people and punish others. That's what happens when authority goes unquestioned. That's what happens when a black child's pain is considered less important than maintaining order. Maya Carter learned that lesson on her knees in a school hallway, tears and chemicals streaming down her face, gasping for air that wouldn't come, while the officer who'd assaulted her stood over her without a trace of remorse. But Officer Derek Morrison had made one critical mistake. He'd underestimated Maya's father. And in 48 hours, Marcus Carter would make sure that mistake cost Morrison everything. The pepper spray had barely settled in the air when Chelsea Bradford transformed into the perfect victim. Her posture shifted, her shoulders curling inward, her hand rising to her throat in a gesture of distress that would have been convincing if you hadn't seen what actually happened just seconds before. Officer Morrison turned to her, his body language protective, concerned in a way he'd never been toward Maya, and Chelsea's voice came out trembling, rehearsed, practiced. "She attacked me," Chelsea said, her eyes wide and frightened. "I was just walking by and she just attacked me for no reason. It was a masterclass in manipulation. It was a lie so brazen, so complete, that it should have been laughable except for one critical fact. People believed her. Or at least they were willing to pretend they did. The white students who'd watched the whole thing, who'd seen Chelsea push Maya first, who'd seen the aggression and the escalation and knew exactly who was at fault, they nodded. They corroborated. They backed up Chelsea's version of events with the kind of casual cruelty that comes from knowing the system will believe them over the truth. One girl, a friend of Chelsea's named Madison, stepped forward without being asked. Maya was screaming at her, Madison said, her voice helpful, concerned. Chelsea was trying to get away and Maya kept coming at her. "I saw the whole thing." Others joined in, a chorus of witnesses creating a narrative that had nothing to do with reality and everything to do with protecting one of their own. "He had to do something," another student said, gesturing at Officer Morrison like he was a hero. She was out of control. Maya was still on the ground, still gasping, still burning, but she could hear them. Through the pain and the tears and the chemicals searing her skin, she could hear them rewriting history, erasing her truth, building a story that would justify what had been done to her. She tried to speak, tried to explain, her voice coming out in broken gasps between coughs. "That's not," she managed, her throat raw, her words barely audible. "That's not what happened. She pushed me. I didn't." But Officer Morrison wasn't interested in her version. He stood over her, his presence intimidating, his hand still near his pepper spray as if she might somehow still be a threat despite being incapacitated on the floor. "You need to calm down," he told her, his voice cold, official. "You're only making this worse for yourself. Making it worse." As if being pepper sprayed in the face wasn't bad enough. As if the burning and the gasping and the humiliation wasn't sufficient punishment for the crime of being black in a school hallway. Jasmine was crying now, her hands shaking as she tried again to reach Maya, and again Officer Morrison blocked her path. "You need to step back," he commanded, and Jasmine did, because what choice did she have? She was a student and he was authority, and challenging him meant risking the same treatment Maya had just received. But Jasmine's eyes met Maya's for just a second, and in that look was solidarity, witness, a promise that someone had seen the truth even if no one was willing to speak it. David had run for the principal, pushing through the crowd of students who were still filming, still watching, treating Maya's suffering like content for their social media feeds. Some of them were already posting, already adding captions, already framing the narrative in ways that would trend, that would get likes, that would reduce a 14-year-old girl's trauma to entertainment. And Chelsea Bradford, standing safely behind Officer Morrison, whispered something to her friends that made them laugh. Actually laugh. While Maya suffered on the ground in front of them, while her face burned and her lungs struggled for air, Chelsea and her circle found something amusing enough to giggle about. It was a cruelty so casual, so thoughtless, that it revealed something dark about who these girls were, about what they'd been taught was acceptable, about how little empathy they'd been raised to have for people who didn't look like them. The pain Maya felt in those moments went beyond physical. Yes, her skin was on fire. Yes, every breath felt like inhaling flames. Yes, her eyes burned so intensely she thought she might never see clearly again. But worse than all of that was the knowledge that she was alone. Surrounded by dozens of students, watched by a school full of people, and she was completely, devastatingly alone in her suffering. Eventually, someone, a teacher drawn by the commotion, insisted that Maya needed medical attention. Officer Morrison allowed it, finally, as if he were doing her a favor by permitting her to receive care for the injuries he'd inflicted. They half-carried, half-walked Maya to the nurse's office, her legs unsteady, her vision still blurred from the chemicals and the tears. The school nurse, Mrs. Patterson, was a black woman in her 50s who'd worked at Westbridge Preparatory for nearly 2 decades. She'd seen a lot in that time. She'd bandaged injuries and dispensed medication and comforted students through various crises. But when she saw Maya's face, when she saw the swelling already beginning around the girl's eyes, the redness spreading across her skin, the way Maya was still struggling to breathe properly, Mrs. Patterson's professional composure cracked. "Oh honey," she said softly, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Oh honey, what did they do to you?" She worked quickly, efficiently, flushing Maya's eyes with water, applying cool compresses to try to ease the burning, documenting every visible injury with the thoroughness of someone who knew this documentation would matter. And as she worked, she spoke quietly, just loud enough for Maya to hear. "This wasn't right," Mrs. Patterson said, her hands gentle as she tended to Maya's injuries. "What happened to you wasn't right. I'm documenting everything, you understand? Everything." It was the first acknowledgement Maya had received that what happened to her was wrong. The first adult who'd seen her suffering and called it what it was: injustice. Maya wanted to thank her, wanted to express the gratitude flooding through her, but her throat was still too raw, her voice too broken, so she just nodded, tears continuing to stream down her face. That's when Principal Whitmore arrived. Richard Whitmore had been principal of Westbridge Preparatory for 7 years, and in that time he'd cultivated a reputation for maintaining order, for running a tight ship, for keeping parents happy and donors satisfied. He was a tall man with graying hair and the kind of polished professionalism that looked good in fundraising brochures. He walked into the nurse's office with confidence, with authority, with the demeanor of someone who already knew how this situation would be handled. He glanced at Maya briefly, his expression showing mild concern but nothing approaching the horror that should have been there. Then he turned to Mrs. Patterson. "What's her condition?" Mrs. Patterson's jaw tightened. "She's been pepper sprayed in the face from close range, Principal Whitmore. She has significant chemical burns, her airways are compromised, and she's experiencing severe pain. This child needs to be seen by a doctor, not just a school nurse." Whitmore nodded as if this were a minor inconvenience rather than a serious injury. "I see. We'll contact her parents, of course. But I want to be clear, Officer Morrison maintained order during a volatile situation. These situations require split-second decisions." Mrs. Patterson's eyes flashed. "This child is 14 years old and weighs maybe 110 pounds. What exactly about her required pepper spray?" But Whitmore had already turned away, already moving on to damage control rather than accountability. Maya tried to speak, tried to tell her side of what happened, but her voice came out as barely more than a rasp. "She pushed me first," Maya managed. "I didn't do anything." Whitmore's expression didn't change. "We'll be conducting a full investigation, Miss Carter. Right now, you need to focus on recovering." It was dismissal dressed up as concern. It was the language of institutions protecting themselves rather than the children in their care. And Maya, even through the pain and the trauma, recognized it for what it was. The school called Marcus Carter and told him there had been an incident involving his daughter. Not that she'd been assaulted. Not that she'd been pepper sprayed. Just that there had been an incident and he should come to the school. The administrative assistant who made the call had been instructed to keep it vague, to downplay the severity, to control the narrative before Marcus even arrived. But the carefully casual tone of that phone call did nothing to prepare anyone for what happened when Marcus Carter walked through those doors. He arrived in 15 minutes, which meant he'd broken every speed limit between his office and the school. Marcus had been in a meeting with senior partners when his phone rang, and something about the school's number appearing on his screen in the middle of a weekday made his stomach drop. He'd left immediately, not even bothering to grab his briefcase, just his keys and his phone, driving with the kind of focused intensity that came from years of knowing that when institutions called about incidents involving black children, it was never good. When he walked into the nurse's office and saw his daughter, saw Maya's swollen face and red eyes and the way she was still struggling to breathe normally, something inside Marcus Carter crystallized into cold, methodical fury. His hands shook as he crossed the room to her, the only outward sign of the emotion roiling inside him, because everything else about Marcus remained calm, controlled, professional. He knelt beside Maya, his hand gentle on her shoulder, his voice soft. "Baby, I'm here. Daddy's here now." Maya looked at him through eyes that could barely open and started crying harder, the kind of crying that came from relief and pain and the overwhelming comfort of having someone who loved you unconditionally in the room. "Daddy," she whispered. "Dad, I didn't do anything. I didn't do anything wrong." "I know," Marcus said, his voice steady even as his hands shook. "I know, sweetheart. We're going to handle this." He stood slowly, his eyes moving from his daughter to Mrs. Patterson to Principal Whitmore, who'd been standing in the corner watching this reunion with barely concealed impatience. Marcus's voice when he spoke was calm, professional, the voice of an attorney who'd spent decades in courtrooms facing down injustice. "What happened to my daughter?" Principal Whitmore stepped forward, his expression sympathetic in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Carter, I understand this is upsetting, but there was an altercation in the hallway. Maya was involved in a physical confrontation with another student. Officer Morrison intervened appropriately to de-escalate the situation and ensure student safety." The word appropriately hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus looked at his daughter's injured face, at the medical supplies Mrs. Patterson had used to treat chemical burns, at the way Maya was still breathing in shallow gasps because her airways had been compromised by a weapon designed for violent criminals. Then he looked back at Whitmore. "Appropriately," Marcus repeated, his tone flat. "You believe pepper spraying a 14-year-old girl in the face from close range is appropriate intervention?" Whitmore's expression hardened slightly. "Officer Morrison is a trained law enforcement professional. He assessed a volatile situation and made the decision he felt was necessary to maintain order and protect students." "Protect students," Marcus said. "Which students was he protecting, Principal Whitmore?" "Because from where I'm standing, the only student who needed protection was mine, and she's the one who got assaulted." "Mr. Carter," Whitmore said, his voice taking on an edge of condescension, "I understand you're upset, but—" Marcus cut him off, his voice still calm but carrying an authority that made Whitmore stop mid-sentence. "I'm not upset. I'm methodical. There's a difference. And what I need from you right now is very simple. I need the security footage from that hallway. I need witness statements from every student who was present. I need Officer Morrison's incident report. And I need all of it before I leave this building today." Whitmore's expression shifted to defensive. "Mr. Carter, these things take time. We have procedures, protocols. The investigation has just begun and—" "My daughter has chemical burns on her face from a weapon deployed by your employee," Marcus interrupted, his calm never breaking, which somehow made his words more powerful than if he'd been shouting. "Either you provide me with that documentation now or my next conversation will be with the Department of Education, the Police Oversight Board, and every media outlet in the state. Your choice." The room went silent. Mrs. Patterson was watching with barely concealed satisfaction. Maya was looking at her father with a mixture of relief and awe, because this was what Marcus Carter did, this was who he was, this was why people who'd been wronged by the system sought him out. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply laid out reality with such clarity that the choice became obvious. Whitmore's face had gone slightly pale. He stammered, "I'll see what I can do. But Mr. Carter, you have to understand, the security system has been experiencing some technical difficulties. The footage from that particular hallway may not be available." "How convenient," Marcus said, his tone making it clear he didn't believe a word of it. "How remarkably convenient that the cameras malfunction on the same day my daughter is assaulted in your hallway." "It's not like that," Whitmore protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Marcus pulled out his phone, his movements deliberate. "Then I'll expect a full written explanation of this technical malfunction, including when it was reported, who was notified, and what steps were taken to repair it. I'll also need the names and contact information of every student who witnessed the incident, since the security footage is apparently unavailable. And I want all of this in writing, Principal Whitmore. All of it." Whitmore opened his mouth, closed it, then nodded stiffly. "I'll have my assistant prepare the documentation." "Good," Marcus said. In the meantime, I'm taking my daughter to the hospital to be properly evaluated by medical professionals. Mrs. Patterson, I'd appreciate it if you could provide me with copies of your medical documentation as well. Of course, Mr. Carter, Mrs. Patterson said immediately, already moving to make copies. I documented everything. Marcus helped Maya to her feet, his arm around her shoulders, supporting her weight as they walked toward the door. But before they left, he turned back to Whitmore one more time. One more thing, Principal Whitmore. Where is Officer Morrison right now? Whitmore shifted uncomfortably. He's been placed on administrative duty while we conduct our investigation. Administrative duty, Marcus repeated. So he's still here. Still working. Still collecting his paycheck. My daughter gets pepper sprayed in the face and she's the one who had to go to the nurse's office, while the man who assaulted her continues his normal day. It's protocol, Mr. Carter, Whitmore said weakly. Marcus's laugh was bitter. Protocol. That's an interesting word for protecting someone who just used excessive force on a child. We'll see what the review board thinks about your protocols. And with that, Marcus Carter walked out of Westbridge Preparatory Academy with his injured daughter, leaving behind a principal who was already making phone calls to the school board, to the district's lawyers, to anyone who might help him manage what he knew was about to become a very serious problem. The drive home was quiet. Marcus wanted to ask Maya questions, wanted to understand exactly what had happened, but he could see she was exhausted, traumatized, still in pain despite the medication Mrs. Patterson had given her. So he just drove, one hand on the wheel and one hand holding Maya's, letting her know through that simple contact that she wasn't alone, that he was there, that everything was going to be alright even though they both knew it wasn't, not yet. When they got home, Marcus helped Maya to the bathroom, his movements gentle as he helped her wash her face again, applying fresh cold compresses to ease the burning that still hadn't fully subsided. He'd seen chemical burns before in his work, had represented clients who'd been victims of excessive force, but seeing it on his own daughter's face was different. Every wince, every gasp of pain, every tear that rolled down her swollen cheeks felt like a knife to his heart. But Marcus kept his expression calm, kept his hand steady, because Maya needed him to be strong right now. She needed him to be the father who could make things right, not the father who fell apart at the sight of her suffering. It wasn't until he'd settled her on the couch with more ice packs, until he'd made sure she had water and medication and everything she needed to be comfortable, that Maya finally broke down completely. Not just crying but sobbing, her whole body shaking with the force of emotions she'd been holding back. And these tears weren't from physical pain anymore. They were from something deeper, something that hurt in ways that couldn't be soothed with ice or medicine. Everyone just watched, Dad, Maya said between sobs. They all just stood there with their phones out, recording me like I was some kind of show. Like my pain was entertainment. And Chelsea, she was laughing, Dad. She was laughing while I couldn't breathe. Marcus sat beside her, pulling her close, letting her cry against his shoulder the way she used to when she was little and the world had hurt her. I know, baby, he said softly. I know. But we're going to make this right. I promise you we're going to make this right. But how? Maya asked, her voice muffled against his shoulder. They all lied. They all said I started it. They're going to believe Chelsea, they always believe people like Chelsea, and I'm just... You're not just anything, Marcus interrupted gently but firmly. You are brilliant and strong and worthy of protection and dignity. And what happened to you today was wrong. Completely, unequivocally wrong. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows it. If you've ever felt helpless watching injustice unfold, drop a comment and share your story. And make sure you're subscribed because you need to see how Marcus builds a case that will expose everything this school tried to hide. That night, after Maya had finally fallen asleep, exhausted from pain and emotion, Marcus went into his home office and began making calls. First to his partners at the law firm, briefing them on the situation, asking them to start preliminary research on police misconduct cases, excessive force claims, civil rights violations. Then to civil rights organizations he'd worked with over the years, organizations with resources and expertise in cases like this. And finally, a formal written request to Westbridge Preparatory Academy for all documentation related to the incident. The school's response came the next day, and it was exactly what Marcus had expected. The security footage from the hallway where Maya was pepper sprayed was unavailable due to technical difficulties with the camera system. The investigation was ongoing and would take several weeks to complete. Officer Morrison's incident report was part of an active investigation and therefore couldn't be released. Access to witnesses would need to be approved by parents, and the school couldn't provide contact information due to privacy concerns. It was bureaucracy weaponized as obstruction. It was an institution circling the wagons, protecting its own, making it as difficult as possible for Marcus to gather the evidence he needed. And it told Marcus everything he needed to know about how this was going to play. Westbridge wasn't interested in justice. They were interested in damage control. But Marcus Carter hadn't spent 2 decades fighting systemic injustice without learning how to navigate institutional resistance. He'd expected the roadblocks. He'd planned for them. And he had resources the school didn't know about yet. He interviewed Maya carefully, methodically, setting up his phone to record as she told her story from beginning to end without interruption. He took photos of her injuries every day, documenting the progression of the chemical burns, the swelling, the healing process, creating a visual record of the harm that had been done to her. He gathered every text message, every social media post, every piece of digital evidence that might be relevant. And then he started reaching out to students. Most of them wouldn't talk. Their parents didn't want them involved, didn't want to risk their children standing at a prestigious school, didn't want to make waves that might affect college recommendations or social status. Marcus understood it even as it frustrated him. These were families who'd invested heavily in their children's futures, and they saw protecting that investment as more important than telling the truth about what they'd witnessed. But not everyone stayed silent. David showed up at Marcus's office 3 days after the incident, nervous but determined. He had his phone in his hand, and on that phone was a video that would change everything. David had been filming when the altercation started, had captured Chelsea pushing Maya first, had recorded Morrison's arrival and his immediate bias, had documented the excessive force in high-definition clarity. "Mr. Carter," David said, his voice shaking slightly, "I know my parents told me not to get involved, but I can't just pretend I didn't see what I saw. What happened to Maya was wrong. And I have proof." Marcus watched the video 3 times, his expression neutral but his mind racing with the implications. This was evidence. This was truth captured in a way that couldn't be disputed or dismissed. This was exactly what he needed. "Thank you," Marcus said quietly. "You're showing real courage here, David. More than most adults in this situation." Jasmine came forward too, providing a written statement that detailed everything she'd witnessed, despite knowing it might make her a target for retaliation. Her hands shook as she signed her name at the bottom of the statement, but her voice was firm when she told Marcus, "Maya's my friend. I'm not going to abandon her just because it's inconvenient." And Mrs. Patterson, the school nurse, she provided comprehensive medical documentation showing the extent of Maya's injuries, documentation that made it clear the force used against her was excessive and unnecessary. The report detailed chemical burns, respiratory distress, psychological trauma, all inflicted on a 14-year-old girl who posed no threat to anyone. But it was what Marcus discovered next that transformed his understanding of the case from an individual incident to a pattern of systemic abuse. Officer Derek Morrison had a history. 3 prior complaints for excessive force during his time at Westbridge Preparatory. 3 separate incidents where he'd used unnecessary violence against students. And all 3 complaints had been filed by families of students of color. All 3 complaints had been dismissed after cursory investigations. All 3 times the system had protected Morrison and failed the children he'd harmed. Marcus obtained the complaint files through discovery requests and connections he'd built over years of civil rights work. He read each one carefully, seeing the pattern emerge with devastating clarity. A 15-year-old Latino student shoved into a wall for allegedly talking back. A 16-year-old black student placed in a chokehold for walking in the hallway without a pass. A 14-year-old Asian student grabbed and restrained for questioning Morrison's authority. Different students. Different circumstances. Same officer. Same excessive force. Same racial bias. Same institutional protection. The system hadn't just failed Maya. It had been failing students of color at Westbridge Preparatory for years, and the school had allowed it to continue because addressing it would have meant admitting there was a problem, would have meant acknowledging that racism existed in their prestigious institution, would have meant taking responsibility for the harm being done to children under their care. Marcus compiled everything into a case file that grew thicker by the day. Evidence, testimony, medical records, prior complaints, patterns of behavior, institutional failures. He built his case with the precision of a surgeon and the passion of a father who'd watched his daughter suffer and was determined to make sure it meant something, that her pain would lead to change, that no other child would have to experience what Maya had experienced. And as he worked late into the nights, organizing evidence and preparing legal strategies, Marcus Carter made a promise to himself and to his daughter. Westbridge Preparatory Academy and Officer Derek Morrison had made a catastrophic mistake when they pepper-sprayed Maya Carter. They'd assumed she was just another black child whose pain didn't matter, whose story wouldn't be heard, whose family didn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back. They'd assumed wrong. And Marcus was going to make absolutely certain they understood exactly how wrong they'd been. Marcus Carter didn't waste time. Within 72 hours of Maya being pepper sprayed, he'd filed a formal complaint with the Westbridge Preparatory Academy School Board, a detailed document that laid out exactly what had happened to his daughter, supported by witness statements, medical records, and video evidence. Simultaneously, he filed a police misconduct report with the department's Internal Affairs Division, making sure that both the school and the police department understood that this wasn't going away quietly, that Maya's assault wouldn't be swept under the rug with vague promises of internal investigation. The school board meeting was scheduled for the following week, and Marcus made sure he was on the agenda. Public comment period. 3 minutes to present his case to the people who had the power to remove Officer Morrison from the school, to hold him accountable, to protect the students under their care. But when Marcus walked into that school board meeting, he immediately understood that this wasn't going to be a fair hearing. It was going to be a battle. The room was packed. Every seat filled, people standing along the walls, the air thick with tension and barely concealed hostility. And a significant portion of that crowd was there for one reason: to support Officer Morrison and defend the school's decision to keep him employed. Marcus recognized many of them. Parents of Chelsea's friends. Members of the country club where the Bradford family held court. Donors whose names appeared on plaques throughout Westbridge Preparatory. People with money, with influence, with a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. And at the center of it all sat Robert Bradford, Chelsea's father. Bradford was a real estate mogul who'd made his fortune developing luxury properties and had the kind of wealth that translated directly into power. He sat in the front row, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, his expression radiating the confidence of a man who was used to getting his way. Around him sat his allies, other board members and community leaders who'd already decided how this meeting would go before Marcus ever spoke a word. The board went through their usual business first, approving budgets and discussing mundane policy updates, drawing out the time before public comment in a way that felt deliberately designed to test Marcus's patience. But Marcus sat calmly, his briefcase on his lap, his expression neutral, waiting. He'd waited through worse. He could wait through this. Finally, the board president, a white woman in her 60s named Margaret Henderson, called for public comment. "Mr. Marcus Carter," she said, her tone professionally neutral but her eyes wary, "you have 3 minutes." Marcus stood, walked to the podium, and placed his briefcase on the surface with a soft thud that somehow commanded the room's attention. He didn't rush. He took his time, opening the briefcase, removing his documents, arranging them deliberately. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, the voice of an attorney who'd spent decades in courtrooms and knew exactly how to command a room. "My name is Marcus Carter," he began. 2 weeks ago, my 14-year-old daughter, Maya Carter, was pepper sprayed in the face by Officer Derek Morrison in the hallway of Westbridge Preparatory Academy. She was not armed. She was not violent. She was not a threat to anyone. She was an honor student defending herself from another student who had physically assaulted her first. And Officer Morrison's response to this situation was to deploy a chemical weapon directly into my daughter's face from a distance of less than 3 feet. The room shifted uncomfortably. Some people looked down. Others stared at Marcus with open hostility, as if his speaking these truths was somehow the real offense. Marcus continued, his tone never changing, never rising into anger, just presenting facts with devastating clarity. My daughter suffered chemical burns, respiratory distress, psychological trauma. She's 14 years old and she was brutalized by a school employee who is supposed to protect her. Now, I've filed a formal complaint, and I've provided substantial evidence to support that complaint. I have witness testimony. I have medical documentation. And I have video footage. He paused, letting that last word hang in the air. Video footage. Evidence that couldn't be disputed or explained away. Margaret Henderson shifted in her seat. "Mr. Carter, we appreciate you bringing this matter to our attention, but I want to assure you that we take all complaints seriously and we're conducting a thorough investigation." "With respect, Mrs. Henderson," Marcus interrupted smoothly, "I'm not here for assurances. I'm here to show you exactly what happened to my daughter, so that you can make an informed decision about whether Officer Morrison should continue to be employed at this institution." He pulled out a tablet, already cued to David's video, and held it up. The board members leaned forward, some reluctant, some genuinely curious. Marcus pressed play. The video showed everything. Chelsea pushing Maya first, the aggression clearly coming from the white student while Maya remained defensive. It showed Morrison arriving and immediately focusing only on Maya, ignoring Chelsea entirely. It showed Maya with her hands visible, non-threatening, trying to comply with contradictory orders. And it showed Morrison deploying pepper spray into the face of a child who posed no danger to anyone. The room went silent. Some of the board members gasped audibly, their faces showing genuine shock. Others, Bradford's allies, kept their expressions carefully neutral, but Marcus could see the calculation in their eyes, already planning how to minimize what they'd just witnessed. As the video ended, showing Maya collapsing to her knees in agony while Chelsea smirked in the background, Marcus spoke again. "This is what happened to my daughter at your school, under your watch, by an employee you hired and continue to protect. The question before you is simple. Are you going to hold Officer Morrison accountable, or are you going to tell every family of color in this community that their children's safety doesn't matter?" Robert Bradford stood up, his movement abrupt, commanding attention. If the board president wanted to maintain order, she made no move to stop him. Bradford's voice boomed across the room, full of righteous indignation and practiced authority. "I've heard enough. Officer Morrison has served this school community for 3 years. 3 years of keeping our children safe in an increasingly dangerous world. He's dealt with countless situations with professionalism and restraint. And now, because of one incident, one moment where he had to make a split-second decision to protect students, we're going to throw him under the bus?" "Protect students," Marcus repeated quietly, his voice cutting through Bradford's bluster. "Which students was he protecting, Mr. Bradford? Because the video clearly shows the only student who needed protection was mine, and she's the one who got assaulted." Bradford's face reddened. "We don't have the full context here. Videos can be edited, can be taken out of context. We don't know what happened before the recording started. We don't know what this girl, what Maya, might have done to escalate the situation. The coded language was obvious to anyone paying attention. This girl. The implication that Maya must have done something to deserve being pepper sprayed. The suggestion that a 14-year-old child was somehow responsible for an adult officer's decision to use excessive force." Other board members who were clearly aligned with Bradford began speaking up, their voices overlapping, creating a chorus of doubt and deflection. "The footage doesn't show everything. We need more investigation. Officer Morrison deserves the benefit of the doubt. We can't rush to judgment. Kids these days are more aggressive. The officer was just doing his job." Marcus listened to all of it, his expression never changing, letting them reveal exactly who they were and where their priorities lay. And when they finally quieted down, waiting for his response, he simply said, "I have additional evidence. Witness statements from other students, medical documentation, and records showing that Officer Morrison has a history of excessive force complaints, all involving students of color, all dismissed without proper investigation." Margaret Henderson held up her hand, clearly uncomfortable with where this was heading. "Mr. Carter will review all the evidence you've submitted. The board will conduct a thorough investigation and make a determination in accordance with our policies and procedures." "How long will that take?" Marcus asked. Henderson glanced at the other board members before responding. "These investigations can take several weeks, sometimes months. We want to be thorough to ensure we have all the facts before making any decisions. And in the meantime," Marcus said, his voice still calm but carrying an edge now, "Officer Morrison remains employed, continues to patrol the hallways, continues to have contact with students. Including my daughter, who would have to return to a school where the man who assaulted her still works. He's been placed on administrative duty," Henderson said quickly. "He's not in direct contact with students during the investigation. But he's still here," Marcus pressed. "Still collecting his paycheck. Still protected by this institution. While my daughter suffers with trauma and chemical burns, Officer Morrison faces no real consequences." The board members shifted uncomfortably. Bradford looked furious, his jaw clenched, clearly not used to being challenged so directly. The audience murmured, some in agreement with Marcus, others in opposition. "The board will vote on how to proceed," Henderson said, her tone making it clear this conversation was over. Marcus watched as the board members held a brief discussion, supposedly deliberating but clearly following a script they'd already agreed upon before the meeting started. When they voted, the result was exactly what Marcus had expected. The board voted to continue the internal investigation, to take no immediate action against Officer Morrison, to protect their employee and their institution's reputation over the safety and dignity of a child. Margaret Henderson delivered the decision with practiced sympathy. "Mr. Carter, we understand your concerns and we take them seriously. The board has voted to continue our thorough investigation into this matter. We'll review all evidence and make a final determination once that investigation is complete." Marcus gathered his documents slowly, deliberately, placing them back in his briefcase with careful precision. Then he looked at the board members, his eyes moving from face to face, making sure each of them understood what he was about to say. "Then we'll see you in federal court." The words landed like a bomb in the quiet room. Bradford's face went pale. Henderson's professional composure cracked for just a moment, because they all understood what that meant. A federal lawsuit would bring discovery, would force them to turn over documents and communications, would expose everything they tried to keep hidden. A federal lawsuit would bring media attention, public scrutiny, national conversation about race and policing and institutional accountability. Marcus walked out of that school board meeting with his head high, knowing he'd just declared war on one of the most powerful institutions in the community. And he was ready for it. The local news picked up the story the next day. A reporter had been at the school board meeting, had heard Marcus's statement, had seen the tension in the room. By evening, Maya's story was the lead on the local news, complete with carefully edited portions of David's video and interviews with community members on both sides of the issue. The response was immediate and divided. Marcus's phone rang constantly with calls from supporters, from civil rights organizations offering assistance, from other families whose children had experienced similar treatment. Protests formed outside Westbridge Preparatory Academy, parents and activists demanding Officer Morrison's firing and calling for accountability. But the backlash was just as fierce. Online forums exploded with defenses of Morrison, with attacks on Maya, with the kind of rhetoric that revealed the deep veins of racism still running through the community. He was just doing his job, people wrote. Kids are so disrespectful these days they don't understand authority. If she'd just listened, none of this would have happened. The coded language of blaming a child for being assaulted by an adult. Social media became a battleground. Hashtags supporting Maya trended alongside hashtags defending Morrison. People who'd never met Maya, who knew nothing about her except what they'd seen in a news clip, felt entitled to judge her, to blame her, to question her character and her actions. And Maya saw all of it. Marcus tried to shield her, tried to keep her away from social media and news coverage, but she was 14 years old in the age of smartphones and constant connectivity. Her friends sent her screenshots. The posts appeared in her feeds. She couldn't escape it even when she tried. The comments were vicious. Death threats sent to her social media accounts. Racial slurs thrown at her with casual cruelty. Strangers telling her she deserved what happened, that she should have been more respectful, that she was playing the victim, that her father was just trying to get money from the school. The harassment was relentless, constant, a digital assault that felt almost as violating as the physical one she'd already endured. Marcus found her one night, sitting in her room with tears streaming down her face, her phone in her hand, reading comment after comment telling her she was worthless, that she didn't belong, that she should kill herself. He took the phone gently from her hands, held her while she cried, and felt his own rage building at a society that would do this to a child who'd already suffered so much. And then there was Chelsea Bradford's contribution to the online conversation. She never mentioned Maya by name, of course. That would have been too direct, too obvious. Instead, Chelsea posted a vague statement about being traumatized by recent events at school, about feeling unsafe, about how hard it was to deal with false accusations. She positioned herself as the victim without ever explicitly saying what she was a victim of, letting her followers fill in the blanks. The post got thousands of supportive comments. People who knew exactly what she was referring to rallied around her, praising her bravery, condemning the people trying to ruin a good officer's career, expressing sympathy for what she was going through. Chelsea's narrative, built on lies and manipulation, was getting more traction than Maya's truth. Have you ever watched someone face public attacks for speaking their truth? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to see how this story ends with justice finally served, hit that subscribe button now because what happens next will shock you. Maya tried to return to school 2 weeks after the incident. Marcus had wanted her to take more time, but Maya insisted she couldn't hide forever, couldn't let them win by making her afraid to walk through those doors. So she went back, wearing her mother's bracelet that Marcus had repaired, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. But the moment she stepped into those hallways, panic hit her like a physical force. Her chest tightened, her breathing became shallow, her vision narrowed. The hallway where she'd been pepper sprayed looked the same, sounded the same, smelled the same, and her body remembered the trauma even as her mind tried to push through it. She made it to her locker before the panic attack overwhelmed her completely, leaving her gasping for air, her hands shaking, her heart racing. Jasmine found her there, crouched by her locker, trying to breathe through the panic. Jasmine sat beside her, didn't try to fix it or minimize it, just stayed present while Maya fought through it. David appeared moments later, creating a protective barrier between Maya and the curious stares of passing students. But not everyone was kind. Former friends, girls Maya had eaten lunch with and studied with and considered close, now avoided eye contact in the hallways. They'd made their calculations, decided that association with Maya was too risky, might damage their own social standing or put them on the wrong side of powerful families like the Bradfords. So they distanced themselves with the casual cruelty of teenagers who prioritize comfort over loyalty. Only Jasmine and David remained truly loyal, standing beside Maya even when it meant facing their own social consequences, their own whispered judgments, their own version of isolation. And Chelsea Bradford, she ran a campaign of whispers and social destruction that was masterful in its subtlety. She never confronted Maya directly, never said anything that could be documented or reported. But the whispers spread through the school like poison. Did you hear what Maya's trying to do to Officer Morrison? She's trying to get him fired over nothing. She's playing the victim. She's the one who started it, you know. My friend was there and said Maya attacked Chelsea first. The lies multiplied, variations on the same theme, all designed to isolate Maya and protect Chelsea's reputation. Teachers treated Maya differently too. Some were sympathetic, offering extensions on assignments, checking in on how she was doing, making it clear they believed her and supported her. But others were cold, distant, treating her like she was the problem, like her presence in their classroom was an inconvenience. One teacher actually told her in front of the class that maybe if she focused more on her schoolwork and less on causing drama, she wouldn't be in this situation. The comment was so inappropriate, so victim-blaming, that even some of the other students looked shocked. But the teacher faced no consequences for it. Maya's grades began to slip. She couldn't concentrate, couldn't focus on assignments that felt meaningless compared to the trauma she was processing. Her mind would wander during lectures, replaying the pepper spray incident, the school board meeting, the hateful comments online. She'd always been an honor student, had always taken pride in her academic achievement, but now even opening her textbooks felt exhausting. And then she quit the debate team. The competition she'd been preparing for, the thing she'd been excited about that morning before everything changed, now felt impossible. Standing up in front of judges and audiences, speaking with confidence and authority, required a sense of self she no longer possessed. The girl who'd been debate team captain felt like a different person, someone from a life that no longer existed. Marcus noticed all of it. He noticed his daughter becoming quieter, more withdrawn, the light in her eyes dimming a little more each day. He noticed the way she'd flinch at unexpected sounds, the way she'd avoid certain hallways at school, the way she'd stop talking about her day when he asked. He noticed her becoming a smaller, sadder version of herself, and it broke his heart in ways the initial assault hadn't. One night, after a particularly difficult day at school, Maya came home and went straight to her room. Marcus gave her some time, then knocked gently on her door. When she didn't answer, he went in anyway and found her sitting on her bed, staring at nothing, tears running silently down her face. He sat beside her, and for a long moment they just existed in that shared silence, the kind of silence that happens between people who love each other and don't need words to communicate pain. Finally, Maya spoke, her voice small and broken in a way that made Marcus want to rage at the world. "Dad, why do they hate me?" The question devastated him. Because Maya wasn't asking about Officer Morrison or the school board or even Chelsea Bradford specifically. She was asking about all of it, about the system that had failed her, about the society that had blamed her for her own assault, about the reality of being black in America and facing hatred for simply existing, for demanding dignity, for refusing to accept injustice. Marcus chose his words carefully, knowing they mattered, knowing she'd remember this conversation for the rest of her life. "They don't hate you, baby. They hate what you represent." "What do I represent?" Maya asked, genuinely confused. "Their own accountability," Marcus said. "You represent the truth they don't want to face. You represent the reality that racism exists in their schools, in their police departments, in their communities. You represent the fact that they've been complicit in a system that protects people like Officer Morrison and fails kids like you. And facing that truth, accepting that accountability, is harder for them than hating you. So they choose hate. Because hate is easier than change." Maya was quiet for a long moment, processing this. Then, so quietly Marcus almost didn't hear her, she said, "I don't know if I can keep doing this." And Marcus understood. He understood the weight of being a symbol, of carrying not just your own pain but the pain of everyone who'd faced similar injustice. He understood the exhaustion of being strong, of being brave, of fighting when all you wanted was to be a normal teenager worrying about normal teenage things. He pulled her close and she curled into him the way she had when she was small, and he said, You don't have to be strong all the time, Maya. You don't have to carry this alone. That's what I'm here for. We're going to get through this together and we're going to make sure it means something. But even as Marcus spoke these words of comfort and determination, even as he held his daughter and promised her justice, he was beginning to understand that this case was bigger and darker than he'd initially realized. The resistance he was facing wasn't just institutional bureaucracy or wealthy families protecting their own. It was something more deliberate, more coordinated, more corrupt. And then the package arrived. It came to Marcus's law office on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, delivered by regular mail with no return address. The administrative assistant brought it to his office with a note that it had been marked personal and confidential. Marcus opened it carefully, lawyer instincts making him cautious about unexpected deliveries. Inside was a thick folder of documents. Photocopies of internal police department files, personnel records, disciplinary reports. And all of it related to Officer Derek Morrison. Marcus spread the documents across his desk, his heart rate increasing as he began to read. Because what he was seeing was Officer Morrison's full disciplinary record, far more extensive than anything that had been officially disclosed. Complaints from his previous department in another state, complaints that painted a picture of an officer with a long history of excessive force, racial bias, and abuse of authority. Morrison had been forced to resign from his previous department after a particularly egregious brutality case involving an unarmed black teenager. The department had given him the option to resign rather than be fired, a common practice that allows problem officers to simply move to new jurisdictions without their full history following them. And Morrison had done exactly that, moving across state lines and applying to smaller departments that might not conduct thorough background checks. But here was the really damaging part. Westbridge's police department had hired him knowing about his history. The documents showed that the police chief, a man named Robert Sullivan, had been provided with Morrison's full background during the hiring process. There were emails discussing Morrison's previous complaints, memos acknowledging the risks of hiring someone with his record. And they'd hired him anyway. Marcus kept reading, his attorney mind cataloging every piece of evidence, every smoking gun, every proof of institutional failure. And then he found the connection that made everything make sense. Police Chief Robert Sullivan and Robert Bradford, Chelsea's father, were college roommates. They'd maintained their friendship for decades, were members of the same country club, served on boards together, were photographed at the same charity galas and golf tournaments. They were part of the same wealthy, connected network that ran this community. Bradford had recommended Morrison for the position at Westbridge. Had vouched for him despite his history. Had used his influence to ensure Morrison was hired even when there were concerns about his background. The system hadn't just failed to protect students of color. The system had been deliberately constructed to protect officers like Morrison, because the people running the system valued their own relationships and their own interests more than the safety of children. Marcus sat back in his chair, the full scope of the corruption spreading out before him like a map. This wasn't just about one officer using excessive force. This wasn't just about a school trying to avoid bad publicity. This was systemic corruption at the highest levels, powerful people protecting each other, institutions designed to serve and protect instead serving as shields for abusers. The anonymous package hadn't included a note, hadn't explained who'd sent it or why. But Marcus didn't need an explanation. Someone inside the system, someone with access to these files, had been troubled enough by what they knew to leak it. Someone with a conscience had decided that the truth needed to come out, even if they couldn't come forward publicly. Marcus spent the rest of that day authenticating the documents, verifying their legitimacy, incorporating them into his growing case file. And as he worked, as the evidence mounted, as the full picture of institutional corruption became clear, Marcus Carter felt something shift inside him. This had started as a case about justice for his daughter, about holding one officer accountable for assaulting one child. But it had become something bigger. It had become a case about exposing systemic corruption, about dismantling the networks of power that protected abusers, about ensuring that what happened to Maya could never happen to another child. The school board thought they could wait him out with their internal investigation. Officer Morrison thought he was protected by his connections and his badge. The police department thought their institutional walls would keep their secrets safe. Robert Bradford thought his money and influence made him untouchable. They were all about to learn exactly how wrong they were. Because Marcus Carter wasn't just fighting for his daughter anymore. He was fighting to tear down a system that had been built to protect people like Derek Morrison at the expense of children like Maya. And he had all the evidence he needed to do exactly that. Marcus Carter filed the federal civil rights lawsuit on a Monday morning, And by Monday afternoon, the entire country was talking about Maya's case. The lawsuit named 4 defendants: Officer Derek Morrison, the Westbridge Police Department, the Westbridge School District, and Principal Richard Whitmore. The charges were extensive and damning: excessive force, racial discrimination, civil rights violations under Section 1983, conspiracy to deprive Maya of her constitutional rights, and deliberate indifference to a pattern of racial bias. The complaint was 147 pages of meticulously documented evidence, witness testimony, expert analysis, and legal precedent. Marcus had spent weeks crafting it, ensuring every claim was supported, every allegation backed by proof, every legal argument airtight. This wasn't just a lawsuit. It was an indictment of an entire system that had failed children of color while protecting the people who harmed them. The press conference was scheduled for noon on the courthouse steps. Marcus stood at a podium bristling with microphones from local and national media outlets, cameras pointed at him from every angle, reporters crowded so tightly that security had to maintain a perimeter. And beside him, standing straight despite the nervousness Marcus could see in the slight trembling of her hands, was Maya. Her physical injuries had faded. The swelling around her eyes had gone down, the redness of the chemical burns had healed, the visible evidence of her assault was mostly gone. But anyone who looked closely could see the emotional scars. The way she held herself a little smaller than before. The wariness in her eyes. The way she touched her mother's bracelet for comfort when the crowd of reporters made her anxious. Marcus began speaking, and the murmur of the crowd fell silent. His voice was steady, controlled, but carried the weight of righteous fury that came from watching his daughter suffer and knowing that suffering was preventable, was unjust, was part of a pattern that had harmed too many children for too long. My daughter, Maya Carter, is 14 years old. She's an honor student, a debate team captain, a young woman with dreams and potential and a future that should be bright. 2 months ago, she was assaulted by a school police officer who deployed a chemical weapon into her face from close range while she was unarmed, non-threatening, and attempting to comply with his commands. The officer who assaulted her, Derek Morrison, did so because he saw a black girl and made assumptions based on her race rather than her actions. The school that employed him protected him rather than my daughter. The police department that hired him knew about his history of excessive force and hired him anyway. And the system that should have held all of them accountable instead tried to silence us, to delay justice, to hope we'd go away quietly. Marcus paused, letting his words settle over the assembled reporters, over the cameras broadcasting this moment to millions of people across the country. We will not go away quietly. Today we filed a federal civil rights lawsuit seeking justice not just for Maya, but for every child who has been failed by systems designed to protect them. We're seeking accountability from everyone who enabled this assault, from Officer Morrison himself to the institutions that hired him, protected him, and allowed him to continue terrorizing children of color. And we're seeking change, real systemic change, so that no other child has to experience what my daughter experienced. The reporters erupted with questions, shouting over each other, microphones thrust forward. Marcus answered some, deflected others, always maintaining that calm, controlled demeanor that made every word he spoke carry more weight. Maya stood silently beside him, and her presence said more than any statement could. This was what they'd done to a child. This was the face of their failure. This was why justice mattered. National media picked up the story immediately. CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, all covering the lawsuit from their various perspectives. Civil rights organizations issued statements of support. The ACLU offered legal assistance. Activists organized protests outside the Westbridge Police Department and the school district offices. Maya's story became part of a larger national conversation about policing in schools, about racial bias, about the school-to-prison pipeline, about how children of color are treated differently, are seen as threats rather than children deserving protection. And then the Department of Justice announced they were launching a review of the Westbridge Police Department's practices, investigating whether there was a pattern of civil rights violations, whether Morrison's case was an isolated incident or part of systemic problems. That announcement sent shockwaves through the department, through the community, through everyone who'd insisted Morrison was just one officer making one mistake and not a symptom of something much larger. Morrison's attorney, a generic defense lawyer named Thomas Brennan who specialized in representing police officers accused of misconduct, tried desperately to spin the narrative. He held his own press conference, standing in front of the police station, insisting that Morrison was a dedicated public servant who'd made a split-second decision in a volatile situation, that he was being unfairly vilified, that this lawsuit was nothing more than an attempt to get money from the city. But Brennan's words rang hollow against the video evidence, against Maya's testimony, against the mounting documentation of Morrison's pattern of abuse. The public wasn't buying it. Even people who typically defended police in these situations found themselves uncomfortable defending the pepper spraying of a 14-year-old girl captured on video from multiple angles. The discovery phase of the lawsuit was where Marcus began systematically dismantling the defendant's defenses. Discovery meant depositions, meant forcing everyone involved to answer questions under oath, meant obtaining documents and communications that revealed the truth they tried to hide. Officer Derek Morrison's deposition was a masterclass in how not to defend yourself. He sat across the table from Marcus, his attorney beside him whispering advice he rarely took, and approached every question with arrogance and defensiveness. Morrison clearly believed he'd done nothing wrong, that he was the victim in this situation, that his authority entitled him to use force however he saw fit. Marcus asked him to describe what he saw when he arrived at the hallway. Morrison described seeing two students in a confrontation, one being aggressive, one being defensive. And when Marcus asked him to identify which student was which, Morrison hesitated, realizing the trap, before finally admitting he'd identified Maya as the aggressor. "And why did you make that assessment?" Marcus asked, his tone neutral, giving Morrison rope to hang himself with. Morrison shifted in his seat. "Based on what I observed," he said. "Based on the situation, the body language, You observed a black girl and a white girl," Marcus interrupted smoothly. "And you immediately assumed the black girl was the aggressor. Is that correct?" "That's not," Morrison started, then stopped, his face reddening. "I made a professional assessment based on my training and experience." "Your training tells you to assume black children are more dangerous than white children?" Marcus pressed. Morrison's attorney objected, told his client not to answer, but the damage was done. The question hung in the air, unanswered because answering it would require Morrison to either admit his bias or lie under oath. Marcus continued, methodical and relentless. "Let's talk about your fear for safety. You stated in your incident report that you feared for the safety of students. Is that correct?" "Yes," Morrison said firmly. "That's correct. You feared for the safety of students when you saw my 14-year-old daughter, who weighs approximately 110 pounds, standing with her empty hands visible against a wall?" "She was being aggressive," Morrison insisted. "She was yelling, refusing to comply with my commands. She was yelling, 'Get off me,' after being physically assaulted by another student," Marcus said. "That's being aggressive?" "I had to assess the situation quickly," Morrison said, his voice rising slightly, becoming defensive in a way that made him look worse. "In those situations you don't have time to—" "You had time to walk through a crowd of students," Marcus interrupted. "You had time to assess the scene. You had time to speak to my daughter. You had time to give her commands. But you didn't have time to ask what happened? To speak to witnesses? To use any de-escalation technique?" Morrison's jaw clenched. "That's not how it works." "Then explain to me how it works," Marcus said, his voice calm, almost conversational. "Explain to me why you felt it was necessary to pepper spray my daughter but not Chelsea Bradford, who multiple witnesses confirm was the actual aggressor." Morrison opened his mouth, closed it, looked at his attorney who was scribbling notes frantically. Morrison started, then stopped. The two situations were different. "Oh?" Marcus asked simply. Morrison couldn't answer. Because any answer would reveal his bias, would admit that the only difference between the two girls was their race and his assumptions about them. The deposition continued for hours, and Marcus extracted admission after admission, contradiction after contradiction. Morrison claimed Maya was a threat but couldn't articulate what specific threatening behavior she'd exhibited. He claimed he followed proper protocols but couldn't explain why those protocols apparently didn't require him to gather basic information before deploying a weapon. He claimed race wasn't a factor but couldn't explain why he treated two students in identical situations so differently. Principal Whitmore's deposition was equally devastating, but for different reasons. Whitmore tried to present himself as a responsible administrator who'd followed proper procedures, but under Marcus's questioning, a different picture emerged. "Were you aware of Officer Morrison's disciplinary history when he was hired?" Marcus asked. Whitmore hesitated. "I was aware there had been some complaints at his previous department, yes." "Some complaints," Marcus repeated. "Were you aware he'd been forced to resign after a brutality case?" "That's not how it was characterized to me," Whitmore said carefully. "How was it characterized to you?" Whitmore shifted. "As a mutual decision for him to pursue other opportunities." Marcus slid a document across the table. "These are the actual records from his previous department. They show he resigned in lieu of termination. Were you aware of that?" Whitmore's professional composure cracked slightly. I was told by the police chief that Officer Morrison's record was solid, that he came recommended. Recommended by whom? Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. By Robert Bradford, Whitmore admitted quietly. Robert Bradford, who sits on the school board. Robert Bradford, whose daughter was involved in the incident that led to my daughter being assaulted. That Robert Bradford? Yes, Whitmore said, even quieter now. The depositions continued. Chelsea Bradford sat across from Marcus with her parents and their expensive attorneys flanking her, coached and rehearsed until every answer sounded like it had been written by a legal team. She wore the perfect outfit, projected the perfect image of a traumatized student, spoke with the perfect amount of emotion. But Marcus had been cross-examining witnesses for 20 years, and he knew how to find the cracks in even the most carefully constructed testimony. Chelsea, Marcus began, his tone gentle, almost fatherly. Can you tell me what happened in the hallway that day? Chelsea recited her version, the one she'd told at the school board meeting, the one that painted Maya as the aggressor. But Marcus listened patiently, taking notes, waiting. You said Maya attacked you, Marcus said when she finished. Can you describe how she attacked you? She pushed me, Chelsea said. She was yelling at me and she pushed me. Before she pushed you, had there been any physical contact between you two? Chelsea hesitated just for a second, but Marcus caught it. Not really, she said. Not really, Marcus repeated. What does not really mean, Chelsea? I mean, we might have bumped into each other in the hallway, but it was crowded. You bumped into her? Or she bumped into you? I don't remember exactly, Chelsea said, but her voice had lost some of its confidence. Marcus pulled out his tablet, queued up David's video. Let me show you something that might refresh your memory. Chelsea's attorneys objected immediately, arguing about the admissibility of the video, but Marcus had already established its foundation in earlier depositions. He played it for Chelsea, and they all watched as the video clearly showed Chelsea deliberately knocking Maya's books out of her hands, stepping on her mother's bracelet, pushing her first. When the video ended, Marcus looked at Chelsea calmly. Does that refresh your memory about who initiated physical contact? Chelsea's face had gone pale. Her parents were whispering urgently to their attorneys. She started, her rehearsed composure shattering. I felt threatened, she said finally. She was yelling at me. She was asking you to apologize for stepping on her mother's bracelet, Marcus said. Is that correct? She was being aggressive, Chelsea insisted, falling back on the word that had been used to justify Morrison's actions. You pushed her first, Marcus said, his tone still calm but relentless. You pushed her against the lockers. And when she said, get off me, you felt threatened? Yes, Chelsea said, but the word came out uncertain, defensive. Why did you feel threatened? Marcus asked simply. Chelsea opened her mouth, closed it. Because she was yelling, she repeated. White girls don't yell. Marcus asked. Or is it specifically black girls yelling that you find threatening? The question hung in the air. Chelsea's attorney objected strenuously, but the damage was done. Chelsea couldn't articulate why she felt threatened by a girl she'd assaulted, couldn't explain why defending oneself from physical assault constituted aggression, couldn't escape the clear implication that her fear was based on racial bias rather than actual danger. More witnesses emerged as the lawsuit progressed. Other students came forward, students of color who'd had their own experiences with Officer Morrison, who'd been targeted, harassed, subjected to excessive force. A Latino student who'd been slammed against a wall for talking back. A black student who'd been put in a chokehold for walking without a hall pass. An Asian student who'd been grabbed and restrained for questioning Morrison's authority. Each testimony added another layer to the pattern Marcus was establishing. This wasn't one incident. This was systemic. This was how Morrison operated. This was who he was. The trial began 3 months after the lawsuit was filed, fast by federal court standards but feeling like an eternity to Maya and Marcus. The courtroom was packed from the moment the doors opened. Media filled the press section, sketch artists positioned to capture every moment since cameras weren't allowed. Community members lined the public seating, activists and supporters on one side, Morrison's defenders on the other. The tension in the room was palpable, electric. Judge Carla Reynolds presided over the trial, a black woman in her 60s with a reputation for running a tight courtroom and tolerating no nonsense from either side. She'd been a federal judge for 15 years, had heard every kind of case imaginable, and approached each one with the same no-nonsense fairness that made attorneys respect and fear her in equal measure. Marcus had made the decision to represent Maya himself rather than bringing in co-counsel. It was risky. Federal civil rights litigation was complex, and having another experienced attorney would have helped with the workload, would have provided backup during the intense days of trial. But this was personal. This was his daughter. And Marcus needed to be the one fighting for her, needed to look the defendants in the eye as he dismantled their defenses, needed to make sure Maya knew her father had done everything possible to get her justice. The defense team was exactly what you'd expect. High-powered attorneys with expensive suits and rehearsed arguments, attorneys who specialized in defending institutions and officers accused of misconduct, attorneys who knew every legal maneuver to minimize liability and shift blame. Opening statements set the tone for everything that would follow. The defense went first, and their lead attorney painted a picture of Officer Derek Morrison as a dedicated public servant, a man who'd spent years keeping students safe, who'd made a split-second decision in a chaotic situation, who deserved the benefit of the doubt and legal protection for doing a difficult job under impossible circumstances. He's not perfect, the defense attorney said, his voice earnest, appealing to the jury's sympathy. No one is. But Officer Morrison was doing his job, was trying to protect students, was faced with a volatile situation and made the decision he felt was necessary in that moment. And now his career, his reputation, his entire life is being destroyed because of one moment, one decision that people with the luxury of hindsight are judging him for. It was a good argument. It appealed to people's natural sympathy for those in difficult positions, their reluctance to judge others harshly, their desire to believe that authority figures generally have good intentions. Then Marcus stood for his opening statement, and the temperature in the room changed. He walked to the jury box slowly, deliberately, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew he was on the right side of history. He looked at each juror, making eye contact, letting them see him not just as an attorney but as a father fighting for his daughter. This case, Marcus began, his voice steady and clear, is about a 14-year-old girl named Maya Carter who was pepper-sprayed in the face by a police officer who saw her skin color before he saw her humanity. It's about a school system that hired that officer knowing his history of excessive force. It's about administrators who protected him instead of the children in their care. And it's about a pattern of racial bias so ingrained, so normalized, that everyone involved genuinely believed they'd done nothing wrong. Marcus paused, letting his words sink in. The defense wants you to believe this was one moment, one split-second decision. But you're going to see evidence that proves this was part of a pattern. Officer Morrison has a history of using excessive force against students of color. The school knew about that history and hired him anyway. And when he assaulted my daughter, they protected him and blamed her. This isn't about one moment. This is about a system that consistently values the comfort and authority of adults over the safety and dignity of black children. Do you believe one person can challenge a corrupt system and win? Share your thoughts below. And subscribe now because you're about to see justice delivered in the most powerful way possible. The trial progressed over 2 weeks, each day bringing new testimony, new evidence, new revelations. Maya took the stand early, and the courtroom fell completely silent as she described what happened to her. She spoke clearly, articulately, her voice steady despite the emotion underlying every word. She described the burning, the inability to breathe, the humiliation of suffering while people laughed and recorded her pain. The defense attorney's cross-examination tried to shake her, tried to make her seem aggressive or unreliable, but Maya held firm. She'd been preparing for this with Marcus, had practiced staying calm under hostile questioning, had learned to stick to the truth no matter how it was twisted. "Didn't you raise your voice at Chelsea Bradford?" the defense attorney asked. "Yes," Maya said calmly. "After she pushed me into the lockers, I raised my voice to say, 'Get off me.' I was defending myself." "You were being aggressive?" "I was being loud," Maya corrected. "There's a difference between being loud when you're being assaulted and being aggressive." Mrs. Patterson, the school nurse, testified about Maya's injuries, about the severity of the chemical burns, about the psychological trauma. She also testified about Officer Morrison's demeanor when he brought Maya to her office. "He showed no concern for her well-being," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "He was more interested in justifying what he'd done than ensuring she received proper care." David's video was played for the jury, and the courtroom watched in complete silence. Jurors leaned forward, studying every frame. The video showed everything. Chelsea's aggression. Maya's defensive posture. Morrison's arrival and immediate focus on Maya. The pepper spray deployed at close range. Maya's collapse. The audio picked up Chelsea's smirk-tinged comments to her friends, picked up Morrison's commands directed only at Maya, picked up Maya's gasps and cries. When the video ended, several jurors were wiping their eyes. The visual evidence was damning in ways that testimony alone could never be. Officer Derek Morrison took the stand in his own defense, and it was immediately clear this was a mistake. His attorneys had probably advised against it, But Morrison's ego demanded he defend himself, explain himself, make the jury understand that he was the real victim here. Marcus's cross-examination was surgical, precise, devastating. He asked simple questions that Morrison couldn't answer without revealing his bias. He caught Morrison in contradictions between his deposition testimony and his current statements. He got Morrison to describe his threat assessment process in ways that made it clear Morrison had made assumptions based on race rather than behavior. And then Marcus asked the question that changed everything. "Officer Morrison, when you saw Maya and Chelsea in that hallway, what made you identify Maya as the threat?" Morrison's face reddened. "Based on the situation, based on what I observed." "What specifically did you observe?" Marcus pressed. "What behavior, what action, what specific thing did my daughter do that made you see her as dangerous?" "She was being aggressive," Morrison said, the word automatic now, a defense mechanism. "Chelsea had pushed her into lockers," Marcus said calmly. "Chelsea had initiated physical contact. Chelsea was the aggressor by any objective standard. But you didn't see Chelsea as a threat. You saw my daughter as a threat." "What?" Morrison's anger began to show through, the professional veneer cracking. "Kids like her," he started, then stopped abruptly, realizing what he'd just said. The courtroom reacted immediately. Murmurs, gasps, the sound of pencils scratching as reporters documented the slip. "Kids like her. Kids like Maya. Black kids." Marcus let the words hang in the air for a long moment. "Kids like her," he repeated quietly. "What does that mean, Officer Morrison? What kind of kid is my daughter?" Morrison's attorney was objecting, trying to control the damage, but it was too late. The mask had slipped. The bias that had driven Morrison's actions was now spoken aloud, admitted in open court. The expert witnesses Marcus brought in systematically dismantled any defense of Morrison's actions. Police procedures experts testified that Morrison had violated every protocol for de-escalation, that deploying pepper spray against a non-threatening juvenile was excessive force by any standard, that his failure to gather basic information before acting was incompetent at best and deliberately biased at worst. Use of force experts explained to the jury exactly what pepper spray does to the human body, explained why it should never be used at close range, explained why deploying it against a child was particularly dangerous and traumatic. Child psychology experts testified about the lasting trauma Maya would carry, about how being assaulted by an authority figure who was supposed to protect her had damaged her sense of safety and trust in ways that would take years to heal. Marcus's closing argument brought everything together, connecting Officer Morrison's individual act to the larger pattern of systemic racism, institutional failure, and deliberate indifference to the suffering of children of color. "Maya Carter is 14 years old," Marcus said to the jury, his voice carrying the weight of everything this trial had revealed. "She is a child. She was a child when Officer Morrison pepper sprayed her in the face. She was a child when the school protected her assailant instead of her. She was a child when the system failed her in every possible way. And the question before you now is simple. Does her childhood matter? Does her pain matter? Does her humanity matter? Or do we live in a society where black children are seen as threats deserving violence rather than children deserving protection? Your verdict will answer that question not just for Maya but for every child of color who walks through school hallways wondering if they're safe, wondering if they matter, wondering if the system that claims to protect them will actually do so when it matters most." The jury deliberated for 6 hours. 6 hours where Marcus and Maya sat in the courthouse hallway, waiting, hoping, preparing for either outcome. 6 hours where the community held its breath, where protesters gathered outside, where the media speculated about what the verdict would mean. And when the jury came back, when they filed into the courtroom and took their seats, when the foreperson stood to deliver their verdict, the entire room went silent. Because everyone understood that this verdict was about more than one case, one girl, one officer. This verdict was about whether accountability was possible, whether justice could be achieved, whether the system could actually protect the children it claimed to serve. The foreperson's voice rang clear in the silent courtroom. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Maya Carter, on all counts." The jury filed back into the courtroom at 4:37 in the afternoon, after 6 hours of deliberation that felt like 6 years to everyone waiting. Marcus sat in the plaintiff's chair, his posture perfectly composed, his hands folded on the table in front of him, but if you looked closely you could see the slight tension in his jaw, the way his fingers gripped each other just a little too tightly. Beside him, Maya sat smaller, quieter, her hand finding her father's under the table and holding on like it was the only thing keeping her anchored. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. People stood along the back wall because there were no seats left. The media section was filled with reporters who'd been covering this case for months, their notebooks ready, their expressions showing they understood this verdict would be national news regardless of which way it went. Community members who'd followed every moment of the trial sat divided, supporters of Maya on one side, defenders of Morrison and the system on the other, the physical space between them representing the larger divide this case had exposed. Judge Carla Reynolds entered and everyone stood, the rustle of movement like a wave through the overcrowded room. She took her seat, her expression revealing nothing, her voice steady and professional as she asked the jury foreperson if they'd reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor," the foreperson said, a middle-aged black man who'd listened to every word of testimony with an intensity that suggested he understood the weight of what he and his fellow jurors were deciding. The court clerk took the verdict form from the foreperson, walked it to Judge Reynolds, who reviewed it silently, her face still showing nothing. Then she handed it back to the clerk and instructed the foreperson to read the verdict aloud. The moment stretched, suspended, everyone in that courtroom holding their breath. Maya's hand squeezed Marcus's tighter. Marcus's other hand came up to cover hers, surrounding it completely, a father's protection made physical. In the matter of Carter versus Morrison, the Westbridge Police Department, the Westbridge School District and Principal Richard Whitmore, the foreperson began, his voice clear and strong. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Maya Carter, on all counts." The courtroom exploded. The words were barely out of the foreperson's mouth before people were reacting, some cheering, some crying, some sitting in stunned silence. Maya's supporters erupted in celebration, months of tension and fear and hope releasing all at once. Morrison's defenders sat frozen, faces pale, unable to process that the system they'd trusted to protect one of their own had actually held him accountable. Judge Reynolds brought her gavel down hard, multiple times, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Order. Order in this courtroom." But even as the noise died down to whispers and muffled sobs, the emotion remained thick in the air. Because everyone understood what had just happened. A 14-year-old black girl had challenged powerful institutions, had faced down systemic racism and corruption, and had won. The foreperson continued reading. "On the charge of excessive force, we find Officer Derek Morrison liable. On the charge of racial discrimination, we find all defendants liable. On the charge of civil rights violations, we find all defendants liable. On the charge of conspiracy and deliberate indifference, we find the Westbridge Police Department and the Westbridge School District liable." Each finding landed like a hammer blow. Marcus kept his expression controlled, professional, but Maya could feel the tension releasing from his body, could feel the vindication flowing through him even as he remained outwardly calm. The jury awards compensatory damages in the amount of $2.5 million, the foreperson continued. Additionally, the jury awards punitive damages in the amount of $5 million, to be paid by all defendants jointly and severally. $7.5 million. It was a staggering amount, the kind of verdict that sent a message beyond just compensation for Maya's injuries. Punitive damages were meant to punish, to deter, to make institutions understand that the cost of protecting abusers was higher than the cost of doing what was right. This verdict was the jury saying that what happened to Maya was unconscionable, that the system's failure to protect her demanded the kind of financial penalty that would force real change. Maya started crying. Not quiet tears, but the kind of sobbing that came from somewhere deep inside, months of pain and fear and humiliation and trauma finally finding release. She'd been so strong for so long, had held herself together through the assault and the aftermath and the public scrutiny and the trial, and now she could finally let it all out. Marcus pulled her into his arms, holding her the way he'd held her when she was small and the world had hurt her, and his own eyes were wet even as he whispered comfort into her hair. Around them people were crying too. Jasmine and David, sitting in the front row behind the plaintiff's table, held each other and wept with relief and joy. Mrs. Patterson, the school nurse who documented Maya's injuries and testified despite the risk to her job, covered her face with her hands and let the tears come. Community members who'd supported Maya throughout this ordeal embraced each other, celebrating not just a legal victory but a moral one, a victory that said their children mattered, their pain mattered, their humanity mattered. On the other side of the courtroom the reaction was very different. Officer Morrison sat rigid, his face drained of color, his mouth slightly open in shock. His attorneys were already whispering urgently about appeals, about legal options, but Morrison didn't seem to hear them. He was staring at nothing, processing the reality that his career was over, his reputation destroyed, his actions finally catching up to him in a way the system had protected him from for so long. Principal Whitmore looked like he might be sick. School district attorneys were gathering their papers with shaking hands, already thinking about damage control, about insurance coverage, about how to explain to the school board that they were now liable for $7.5 million because they protected an abusive officer instead of the children in their care. Robert Bradford, Chelsea's father, sat in the back row looking pale and furious. He'd wielded his influence and his wealth to protect Morrison, to protect his daughter's lies, to maintain a system that served people like him. And the jury had just told him that his influence wasn't enough, his wealth couldn't buy impunity, the system he'd manipulated had finally found the backbone to hold him and his allies accountable. Judge Reynolds, once order had been restored, thanked the jury for their service and dismissed them. Then she set a date for a hearing on injunctive relief, because Marcus had also sought court orders mandating specific reforms to prevent this from happening again. The monetary damages were important, but the systemic changes would be Maya's real legacy. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Marcus and Maya remained seated for a long moment, just holding each other, letting the reality of what they'd accomplished sink in. They'd faced enormous power and won. They'd challenged a corrupt system and forced accountability. They'd taken pain and trauma and transformed it into justice. The consequences came swiftly, like dominoes falling one after another, each revelation and resignation and reform building on the last. Officer Derek Morrison was fired from the Westbridge Police Department within 48 hours of the verdict. Not placed on administrative leave. Not suspended pending further review. Fired. Terminated immediately. And because the firing was for cause, because he'd been found liable for civil rights violations and excessive force, he lost his pension, lost the retirement benefits he'd been counting on, lost everything he'd built over his career in law enforcement. But the financial penalty wasn't the end of Morrison's consequences. The district attorney, who'd been watching the trial closely and reading the public sentiment, announced that criminal charges would be filed against Morrison for assault and battery. Civil liability was one thing, but the DA made it clear that pepper spraying a child constituted criminal conduct that deserved prosecution beyond the civil courts. Morrison, who'd spent his career on the side of law enforcement, would now face the criminal justice system as a defendant. Principal Richard Whitmore resigned the day after the verdict, though the official statement called it retirement. The reality was that the school district had made it clear his position was no longer tenable. The trial had exposed how he'd hired Morrison despite knowing his history, how he'd protected Morrison after the assault, how he'd prioritized institutional reputation over student safety. Parents were demanding his removal, teachers had signed petitions calling for new leadership, and the school board understood that Whitmore staying would mean continued liability and public relations disasters. So Whitmore retired, with no ceremony, no celebration of his years of service, just a quiet exit from an institution he'd failed to protect. The school board members who'd been Robert Bradford's closest allies, the ones who'd voted to protect Morrison and dismiss Maya's complaint, found themselves facing recall petitions. Community members who'd been energized by Maya's case channeled that energy into local politics, gathering signatures, organizing campaigns, demanding accountability not just from one officer but from the entire system that had enabled him. Several board members resigned rather than face recall elections they knew they'd lose. Others tried to weather the storm but found themselves voted out in the next election cycle. The political landscape of Westbridge changed because parents and community members decided they'd had enough of leadership that protected adults at the expense of children. The police chief, Robert Sullivan, Morrison's friend and the man who'd hired him despite his history, announced his resignation in a press conference where he admitted to errors in judgment but stopped short of acknowledging the full scope of his misconduct. His resignation was effective immediately, and the search for a new chief came with explicit requirements for someone committed to reform, to transparency, to community accountability. And the reforms themselves, they were substantial and meaningful, the kind of changes that Maya's case had made politically impossible to resist. Body cameras became mandatory for all school resource officers, with policies requiring the cameras to be active during all interactions with students. Bias training was implemented not just for officers but for all school staff, addressing implicit racial bias and how it affects discipline and safety decisions. A civilian oversight board was established, giving community members real power to review complaints and recommend discipline. Use of force policies were completely rewritten, explicitly prohibiting the use of pepper spray or other chemical weapons against students except in the most extreme circumstances of immediate physical danger. These weren't token reforms, weren't performative gestures meant to appease critics. These were substantive changes with teeth, with enforcement mechanisms, with accountability built in. And they happened because Maya's case had exposed the costs of not having them, had shown the community and the courts exactly what happens when police operate in schools without adequate oversight. Robert Bradford faced his own reckoning, though it came from an unexpected direction. The discovery process in Maya's lawsuit had required Bradford to turn over communications and documents, and buried in those materials were emails and records related to his real estate business. White-collar crime investigators noticed irregularities, possible fraud in property valuations, potential tax evasion, dealings that suddenly looked very suspicious under scrutiny. What started as a civil rights lawsuit against a school officer ended up exposing Bradford's own corruption, leading to investigations that would eventually result in criminal charges having nothing to do with Maya's case but everything to do with the kind of person Bradford was, the kind of person who believed rules didn't apply to him. In Chelsea, she transferred schools. Her parents pulled her out of Westbridge Preparatory and enrolled her in a private academy in another district, claiming she needed a fresh start, needed to escape the trauma of being associated with the case. The reality was that Chelsea had become a pariah at Westbridge. Students who'd witnessed her lies, who'd seen the truth come out in court, wanted nothing to do with her. Teachers looked at her differently, knowing she'd lied and let another student suffer for it. Chelsea's social power, which had seemed so absolute, evaporated in the face of documented dishonesty and moral bankruptcy. She ran to a new school where no one knew her history, but the internet is forever, and her testimony was public record, so truly escaping her actions would prove impossible. 6 months after the verdict, Maya Carter stood on a stage at the Regional Debate Championship, facing judges and an audience of hundreds, and delivered a speech titled, "Justice Delayed is Justice Denied." Her voice was strong, confident, showing no trace of the trauma that had nearly broken her. She spoke about her own experience, about the months between being pepper-sprayed and receiving justice, about how every day of delay was another day of suffering, another day institutions protected themselves instead of children, another day the system failed to do what it was designed to do. She won the championship. The judge's decision was unanimous. Maya Carter, who'd quit the debate team in the aftermath of her assault, who'd thought she'd never have the confidence to stand in front of audiences again, had returned stronger than before, had transformed her pain into advocacy, had found her voice in the fight for justice. Marcus sat in the audience watching his daughter accept the trophy, and the pride on his face was so intense it hurt to look at. This was who Maya was becoming. Not defined by what had been done to her, but by how she'd responded to it, by how she'd chosen to use her experience to create change. Maya began speaking at community events, joining Marcus at forums and conferences about police reform, about racial justice, about protecting children in schools. At first she was nervous, speaking to rooms full of adults about policy and systemic change, but she discovered that her story, told in her own words, had power. People listened differently when a 14-year-old girl described being pepper-sprayed in her school hallway. Policy makers who might dismiss statistics and studies couldn't dismiss Maya's testimony about what it felt like to be targeted, assaulted, and then blamed for her own trauma. A scholarship fund was established in her mother's name, the Sarah Carter Memorial Scholarship for students facing discrimination in educational settings. The fund was partially supported by Maya's settlement, money she insisted on using to help other kids who might not have the resources or the support to fight back the way she had. The scholarship helped students afford legal assistance, therapy, educational advocacy, whatever they needed to navigate systems that were failing them. Maya also started visiting middle schools, talking to younger students about their rights, about resilience, about what to do if they faced discrimination or abuse from authority figures. She told them they weren't powerless, that speaking up mattered, that there were people who would believe them and fight for them. For many of these kids, especially kids of color navigating predominantly white schools, Maya became a hero, proof that standing up to injustice was possible and could lead to real change. The healing wasn't linear or simple. Maya still had hard days. She still sometimes woke up from nightmares about the pepper spray, still felt her chest tighten when she walked past the hallway where it happened, still struggled with trust and anxiety in ways that therapy helped but couldn't completely fix. Trauma doesn't disappear just because you win a lawsuit. Justice helps, vindication matters, but the psychological scars take longer to heal than the physical ones. But Maya was doing the work. She was in therapy, processing not just the assault but everything that came after, learning coping mechanisms and healing strategies. She was surrounded by people who loved her and supported her. Jasmine and David remained her closest friends, the loyalty they'd shown during the darkest times cementing a bond that would last a lifetime. And she had her father, Marcus, who'd fought for her with everything he had and continued to be there for her every single day. On a quiet Sunday morning, 6 months after the verdict, Marcus and Maya drove to the cemetery where Sarah Carter was buried. They did this every few weeks, visiting the grave, talking to the woman they'd both loved and lost. Maya always brought fresh flowers. Marcus always spent a few minutes just standing there in silence, communing with his late wife in ways that didn't require words. That morning, Maya placed the flowers in the vase attached to the headstone, then stepped back to stand beside her father. For a long moment they just looked at the name carved in marble, remembering, feeling, processing. "I think Mom would be proud," Maya said softly, her voice carrying the kind of certainty that came from knowing her mother's values, knowing what she'd stood for, knowing what she would have wanted for her daughter. Marcus put his arm around Maya's shoulders, pulling her close. "I know she would be," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I am." They stood there together, father and daughter, survivors of a trauma that had tried to break them but had instead revealed their strength. Maya had endured physical assault, institutional betrayal, public harassment, and the trauma of reliving her worst moments in front of cameras and juries. And she hadn't just survived it. She'd transformed it. She'd taken her pain and turned it into advocacy, into change, into hope for other kids facing similar injustices. "You didn't just survive this," Marcus said, looking down at his daughter with eyes full of love and admiration. "You changed things. The reforms at the school, the accountability for Morrison, the other kids who'll be safer because of what you went through, that's your legacy, Maya. You made the world a little more just." Maya leaned into her father, feeling the truth of his words settling into her bones. She thought about all the other Mayas out there, all the kids facing discrimination and abuse in schools across the country, all the children who were seen as threats instead of children deserving protection. She thought about the systems that failed them, the adults who looked away, the institutions that prioritized their own protection over children's safety. And she thought about what her case had proven. That challenging those systems was possible. That standing up to injustice mattered. That speaking truth to power could create real change. Because here's what Maya's story really tells us. What happened to her wasn't unique. Right now, in schools across this country, children of color are being treated differently, are being seen as more dangerous, more threatening, more deserving of harsh discipline than their white peers. Right now, school resource officers with histories of excessive force are patrolling hallways, interacting with children, carrying weapons into spaces that should be safe. Right now, institutions are protecting adults who abuse their authority instead of the children who are harmed by that abuse. Maya's story is happening everywhere in different forms with different details, but the same fundamental injustice at its core. The difference is that Maya had a father who was a civil rights attorney, who had the knowledge and resources to fight back. She had friends who were brave enough to speak up as witnesses. She had a nurse who documented everything and testified despite the risk. She had video evidence that couldn't be disputed. She had a combination of factors that made justice possible. But what about the kids who don't have those advantages? What about the families who can't afford attorneys, who don't know their rights, who are afraid of retaliation? What about the cases where there's no video, where the only witnesses are too scared to speak up, where the institutions successfully bury the truth? Those cases still demand justice. Those children still deserve protection. Those families still need support. Every action matters. Every voice matters. When you see injustice, when you witness discrimination, when you know something is wrong, speaking up requires courage but creates change. Staying silent might feel safer, might feel easier, might avoid confrontation, but silence is how systems like this persist. Silence is how officers like Morrison keep their jobs despite patterns of abuse. Silence is how institutions avoid accountability. Silence is how nothing ever changes. Maya could have stayed silent. Marcus could have accepted the school board's dismissal and moved on. The community could have looked away, could have decided this wasn't their fight, could have prioritized comfort over justice. But they didn't. And because they didn't, real change happened. Real accountability was achieved. Real justice was served. If you've made it this far in Maya's story, if you've invested over an hour in understanding what happened to her and how she fought back, then you already care about justice. You already believe that children deserve protection, that systems should serve the people they're meant to protect, that speaking up matters. So here's what you can do. Share this story. Talk about it with your family, your friends, your community. Demand accountability from the schools in your district, from the police departments in your city, from the elected officials who create policies affecting children. Support organizations working for police reform, for racial justice, for protecting student civil rights. Believe children when they tell you they've been harmed. Be the adult who speaks up when others stay silent. And if you're a young person watching this, if you're someone who's faced discrimination or abuse or injustice from people who were supposed to protect you, know that you're not alone. Know that your story matters. Know that there are people who will believe you and fight for you. Know that speaking up is hard but possible, that justice can be achieved, that you have power even when systems try to convince you that you don't. Maya Carter was 14 years old when she was pepper sprayed in a school hallway. She's 15 now, a debate champion, an advocate, a survivor who became a catalyst for change. She still wears her mother's bracelet every day. She still has hard moments. She's still healing. But she's also proof that one person, one voice, one refusal to accept injustice can create ripples that turn into waves that transform entire systems. The reforms in Westbridge are spreading. Other school districts are looking at what happened there and implementing their own changes. Other families are using Maya's case as precedent in their own fights for justice. The conversation about police in schools, about racial bias, about protecting children of color has shifted because Maya's story forced people to confront uncomfortable truths they'd been avoiding. This isn't the end of the fight. Systemic racism doesn't disappear because of one verdict. Institutional accountability requires constant vigilance. But Maya's case proved that change is possible, that justice can be achieved, that standing up to power matters. If this story moved you, if Maya's courage inspired you, if you believe justice matters, then subscribe to this channel and share this video. Leave a comment sharing your own experiences or your thoughts on police reform in schools. Have you or someone you know faced similar treatment? What changes do you want to see in your community? Your voice matters. Your story matters. Together we can demand the accountability our children deserve. Share this story. Demand accountability. Be the change. Because somewhere right now, there's another Maya facing injustice and wondering if anyone cares, if speaking up will matter, if justice is possible. Let's make sure the answer to all those questions is yes.